to be today I'm going to be saying Mr. Beast 200 times. Ready, set, go. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Miss. I can't talk. I'm recording this at 9:12 p.m. Mr. Beast, 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 subscribe to PewDiePie, Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, subscribe to PewDiePie, Mr. Beast, 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 Beast, Mr. 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 Beast meets Mr. Beast, 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 and Mr. Beast. There we go, 200 times. Took me 3 minutes, I think. Oh well. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, turn on post notifications so you don't never miss any videos unless YouTube makes you miss them. And leave a comment and like the video. Thanks for watching.